Welcome back to the Colorado Victim Advocate Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Intervention, Inc. We are a Colorado-based nonprofit organization created in 1986, providing a range of services here in the criminal justice and social justice system. My name is Randy Saucedo. I am the Director of Victim Services here at Intervention and ICCS Community Corrections. Intervention, we provide direct offender supervision and support for those justice-involved people sentenced to probation or community corrections. In addition, we also provide pretrial monitoring, useful public service, and comprehensive victim services. For more information, you can visit our website at www.int-cjs.org. Our podcast, we highlight the wonderful and necessary work of the Colorado victim advocacy community. There are those community-based agencies that provide services to some of the most vulnerable victims, especially children that are physically and sexually abused. And today, we have the privilege of speaking with Jill Johnson, a victim advocate with Ralston House. Welcome to our podcast, Jill.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here. Jill, tell us a little bit about Ralston House, what it is and its mission.
So Ralston House is a child advocacy center. Basically, a child advocacy center is a neutral place where victims, specifically children, can come when they're, like you said, have been victims of sexual abuse or physical abuse. There are about, 18 advocacy centers across Colorado. We currently serve primarily the 1st and 17th judicial districts, which is Adams and Broomfield, Jefferson and Gilpin counties. We are a nonprofit 501c3 agency, and we do have kind of 3-4 locations. So we have locations in Lakewood, Arvada, and Northglenn, which are standalone facilities, and then we also have a wing at the Family Justice Center in Jefferson County.
So, I was not aware of that there are that many or that few, if you want to put it that way, child advocacy centers around the state. And with regards to that, just looking at your history, how was Ralston House created? I mean, what was the kind of the reasoning behind it? Because I know a lot of agencies, come out of a lot of tragedy, a lot of, events that may have occurred. And I just want to know more about, how was Ralston House created?
Yeah, good question. I would say in general, advocacy centers started back in the 70s, kind of early 80s, when they recognized a need to talk to kids in a very specific way that police aren't necessarily trained to do, and also in a better comfortable setting than a police station could offer, for example. And so Ralston House specifically actually originated by the Arvada Police Department. So I think it was the first in Jefferson County, the second across the state in Colorado, that the Arvada PD started back in around 1990, I think, because they saw that need for that child-friendly, safe, neutral environment when victims or crime victims had been identified. Over time, it evolved as the need became greater. Mm-hmm. And so eventually Ralston House became its own nonprofit, like I mentioned earlier, got a full-time forensic interviewer, executive director, the whole 9 yards with that. And then again, kind of progressed with opening other locations and such as well.
So in talking about, Ralston House, with regards to, the services, is it specifically children that are your clients that you're seeing there, on a daily basis?
So the majority of clients that we see, yes, are kids. So we serve up to age 18. But I will say over time, and this is kind of advocacy centers in general too, have seen different situations for different populations. So for example, adults with developmental disabilities, they saw that they tended to do better in that similar setting of kind of that neutral, safe environment. Mm-hmm. So we started doing some of those interviews as well. And then it also transitioned into just adults in general. So depending on maybe their level of trauma or just things that they've experienced when they're working with the police, they maybe noticed, again, this person may do better in this environment. And so they'll bring those cases to us as well. And or we might just see a situation, for example, we had a case where there was a 14-year-old sibling and a 19-year-old sibling. It just made sense to have them both come together, do the experience together, the process together, and not kind of separate those out just because of age. So really we'll serve anyone that people see that have that need, but still the majority of what we serve is that kid population.
And, and speaking of, dealing with children who have been harmed, victimized, a lot of times too, people just don't understand the impacts of what children go through when they come in contact with the criminal justice system. And that could be anything from, the initial 911 response, going through the courts process, all those things like that. What kind of impacts do you see when advocating for children that have been abused?
Yeah, I would say, it very much varies because trauma affects people very differently. So it just depends on kind of person to person and, their personality and their support system and, what they've been through and that type of thing. We see a lot of, kids just struggling in school. Maybe they're struggling to make friends. Maybe they're struggling with what a healthy relationship looks like. We see a lot of also depression, anxiety, suicide ideation is a big thing, especially in the kid group that we see. Could be poor sleeping habits, eating habits, that kind of thing. So trauma just really affects people differently. And I think kids in particular, they don't necessarily know because they're still developing. So they can't necessarily see the full impact of what's gone on or even understand really what is happening to them. And so that can take, time to really process and understand.
And what is the youngest age of somebody that you've had, that you've been providing services to? Because a lot of people would, I know my own experience working when I was a volunteer victims advocate, when I was a staff advocate, and especially when I was at the DA's office in Adams County, we had child abuse cases, whether it be physical or sexual abuse. And a lot of times, one of the first times I came in contact with that was, these children who had been sexually abused. They were specifically targeted for their age, so they couldn't really talk too much about that. How do you deal with, kids like that have been, abused, in some of those horrible ways, but they're so young?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say those are some of the hardest that we see because, we can only interview a kid who can talk. So when you kind of ask what's the youngest we've seen, I would say around 2, but, some 2-year-olds are verbal, some 2-year-olds aren't. And so when you have a really young kiddo, it can be a very scary situation. Now, we get some situations where there are older siblings involved, so we can still interview someone in a particular situation who's maybe not been a direct victim, but maybe is a witness to something. So we get a lot of those cases. But you could have a very vulnerable kid just because of their age and they're not able to share what's going on. And so then you're depending on, other people in the community or family members to really kind of report what they're seeing or what they're experiencing or different behavior changes and that kind of thing. Because if a kid can't tell someone what's going on, it is hard to investigate unless there is, some very specific physical evidence type thing that's going on that can be identified and used in an investigative process. So, those can be really tricky situations.
And so part of that process is that, when a child comes into your agency or some of the other clients that you were speaking about, specifically, what are the services that Ralston House provides to them?
So our main services are forensic interviewing, victim advocacy, and medical exams. So the forensic interview involving our whole multidisciplinary team. So all our referrals come from law enforcement, social services, or the district attorney's office. So they can request, hey, we've got this situation going on. We have this investigation going. We have these folks, typically kids, again, that we want to have interviewed about that. So they can bring them in for that forensic interview. And then we provide victim advocacy to the family or the family members that are also in attendance. Most of the time we have non-offending caregivers that are able to attend with our kiddos. So as victim advocates, we'll meet with them, make sure that they have whatever resources they need. And that could be anything from housing to food to a cell phone to trauma-focused therapy.
Definitely the victim advocacy part comes into play right there.
Right, exactly. So yeah, kind of whatever a family is in need of or identifying in their particular situation, we'll work with them and do some case management there. And then we do also have some medical providers that are in a couple of days a week that we contract with. And so if there are medical exam or medical services needed for kiddos, we'll get those scheduled as well.
And so you've talked a lot about, with regards to one of the main focuses of your agency is with a forensic interview. A lot of people don't know what that is. I mean, because most people would presume that when they're in contact with a child, that would be a detective interviewing the child. And you spoke just a moment of forensic interview, and I'd like you to expand on that. Just talk about specifically what that is and how does it work?
Yeah, so forensic interviewers are specially trained only in forensic interviewing, basically. I mean, they can have different backgrounds and histories and different types of education and things, but there's specialized training for forensic interviewing. And that was created, again, out of the creation of child advocacy centers in general, looking at, wow, we really need a specific way to talk to kids that's different than how police are typically trained to interview suspects. That's more of an interrogation approach and different tips and tricks. And so when we talk to kids, they're not in trouble, they haven't done anything wrong, so we really want to handle them with care. So forensic interviewers receive specialized training, which now in Colorado, they have their own protocol, their own forensic interviewing protocol, which is relatively new in the last handful of years. So they get that specialized training, and then it's typically offered in that advocacy center setting. So it's neutral, it's non-intimidating, it's very child-focused, child-friendly. And how it works is it's kind of like a 3-step process. So the initial process is really just getting to know the kids. So it's not just sending a kid into the room and saying, okay, tell me everything bad that's happened to you. It's really kind of getting them settled, letting them know they're talking to a safe person, explaining how things work, that we do record it and that it's kept as evidence and kept safe and that type of thing and who's listening and all of that. But so they kind of get some rapport going in the beginning. Then they can move into kind of the tell me why you're here, what's been going on, that disclosure phase. And then letting a kid share their narrative, and then they can break it down and kind of go through, more specifics of details of what's really happened in a particular incident or incidents. Then the final stage is kind of like a transitional stage. So it's not just, okay, great, you told me something terrible, now go on with your life. It's,
of course,
okay, is there anything else we missed? Anything else you think we should know? And then kind of what are your plans for the rest of the day? Or, what do you have to look forward to? Just to kind of transition them back into now, we're going to go back with the family and head home or whatever that might look like. And so it's really trying to be a very careful and intentional process to really not add any trauma to what a child's already experienced. And I kind of say, if we were traumatizing kids, we probably wouldn't be in business still. So our goal really is to minimize that re-traumatization and not have that happen so that they feel really safe, really comfortable, and truly that they're in control of what happens. We see a lot of times with victims in particular that they feel a loss of that sense of control. And so no matter the age, kids and adults can both feel that. And so allowing kids to really kind of guide that conversation and really choose what they share, what they don't share, if they need to take breaks, if they need to check in with their parents, if they just need to get some food and water, to really just have the time and space that they need to be able to share whatever has been going on.
And so when you talk about, this interview process, and forensic, so I take it this information is probably going to be more than likely used in court or something to that effect.
Yes, it can be used in court, and kind of the idea of that being a forensic interview, so something that can be used as a piece of evidence. And so that's why, again, we have our multidisciplinary team involved, our MDT, so that they can be present. They can make sure that they're still getting the information they want. So, for example, we aren't police, and so they know the elements of a crime that they need to figure out, date, time, place, that type of thing. And so they can still be present and communicate with our interviewers and make sure we're trying to get as much of that information as possible for the investigation. And then the same thing for caseworkers. They're looking at safety within the home. So are there specific safety questions that they want to look at and pay attention to and make sure that we're gathering information about? And so it all kind of works together to make sure people have as much information as possible that the child's willing to give. And then the police in particular will take that recording as evidence. So when they do file a case, that can be part of the evidence that's presented in an investigation.
So in working with a lot of these police agencies, I mean, you talked about working in the 1st and 17th judicial districts. I mean, do you work with all the police agencies that are in those communities?
We do. So we are the, I guess, official advocacy center for those 2 judicial districts.
Okay.
We also serve anyone who needs us. So, for example, a lot of rural areas don't have their own advocacy center. Like I mentioned, there's only 18 across the state. So certainly not every single place has an advocacy center close by. So we serve anyone who needs us. And that could even be something as simple as Boulder has their own advocacy center, but maybe their family lives closer to us. So in the interest of client customer service,
of course,
they'll use our center to be more accessible to the family, and especially for those resources, because we're going to have more of those resources for that family in their particular area than maybe somewhere else. So we officially serve the 1st and 17th, but we will serve anyone who needs our services.
And so going back a little bit to the beginning of our podcast, you talked about how this agency came out of Arvada PD initially. And with regards to that, is Ralston House, you said it's its own standalone agency, but you still work directly with all of these agencies. Do a lot of these agencies provide direct funding to you?
So a lot of agencies do provide some funding services to us, yes. I would say Arvada specifically, they also provide a lot of in-kind services for us. And so that could be, like our Arvada building is actually owned by the city of Arvada. So that's something that they give us space to use for. And that's across the board. Like Northglenn is the same way. We paid for our building, but we rent the space basically from Northglenn. So different services like that too that cities provide to us, as well as some funding as well, so that we can provide those services free for our families in addition to all of the law enforcement and social services agencies.
So, a big piece of the work that you do, as we talked about earlier, is with regards to the forensic interviewing piece. And I mean, that, I don't know if you have a lot of information about that, but what is the type of background that those folks have? Because that's not something that you hear of all the time. And you hear of, experts, that kind of a thing. I mean, are these forensic interviewers, are they child therapists or what is their background?
So I would say in general, most have a background that's related to some sort of social services or psychology type field.
Okay.
We do require a bachelor's at minimum for all of our forensic interviewers. And yeah, I would say the majority of them, they either, it's criminal justice, psychology, sociology, something along those lines that's related to, working with families and kids in some capacity. So in general, and a lot of them have masters as well, and that could be a master's in social work or, again, psychology or counseling, something along those lines.
And so, in talking about a forensic interview, because I'm sure children, who are going into these things, obviously with regards certainly to their trauma that they've undergone, I mean, when a child walks through your door, I mean, how are you seeing them, when they first come into your, because I think it would be a really scary process for a kid being around a bunch of people they don't know, and they're talking about some really horrific things that have happened to them. I mean, how do you try to, I don't know, make them comfortable when they come in?
Yeah, I would say, we were just talking about this last week, actually, of, how pretty much everything we do, every step we take is very intentional. So from the moment we answer the door, we make sure we're answering the door in a very specific way, that we're warm, we're welcoming, we're doing introductions. So they do, can put a name to a face, that type of thing. And so from the moment they walk into the door, and just how we have it set up, where we have, like a lobby and nice warm colors and, furniture, and, we have a fireplace and a couple settings. And, so just how things are set up is designed to be open and welcoming.
Mm-hmm.
We do offer drinks and snacks. We give a little tour just so, again, they can be kind of familiar with the space, where things are, make sure they have their basic needs met, like food and bathroom, that type of thing. And then let them know where they're going to be, so they kind of see the different rooms and, where their parents will be or caregivers will be, where they'll hang out. We do have playrooms designed for both younger kids and older kids, so that people have a space that they can hang out with before and after their interview. So they just kind of have, again, that friendly space available to them. So, and then that's all done with a victim advocate as well. So we typically have 2 victim advocates on every case. So I mentioned earlier, one providing services to the caregiver as far as resources and that type of thing. But we do have another advocate that will stay with the child during that process. So either during the tour, in the playroom, when they're finished with their interview, to, again, kind of help them transition back. So they're never left alone. They're never left, wandering, trying to figure out kind of what's going on. And all of our advocates are pretty highly trained as well, and very specifically trained in how do we interact with kids? How do we create that warm and welcoming environment? Because, like you said, it can be kind of a strange situation that people aren't typically in.
A lot of times, people, who work in this field, it can be very difficult. And so for your staff, you are hearing these, and for yourself, too, you're hearing these really, quite horrible things that are happening to these children who, quite frankly, are some of the most innocent of victims that we deal with in the system. I mean, how does your staff deal with these type of, situations? Because, I would think it would be very hard to just kind of leave it at work, because, you might be hearing some pretty awful things that are going on.
I would say, definitely depends on the day. Some cases, some situations are harder to process than others. We do tend to debrief quite a bit with each other, just about kind of, things we heard or, concerns we might have, and working with our partner agencies as well, of just, especially, when we're talking with caseworkers who are looking at the safety in the home, or if we have some other, criminal element of concern of safety for the kiddo or family, that we can address with our law enforcement partners as well. So we can debrief with them as needed, but certainly with each other after a case, we kind of talk through some things, or if we're having a hard time just processing something. A lot of us do a typical, we have therapists as well to kind of process through.
It's understandable.
Yeah, harder days. But I will say a lot of it is, I think we do have the heart for the work, and we understand its greater purpose. And so when you have something greater than yourself and bigger than yourself, it also kind of helps you to pull through that, because it's not about us, it's about these families. And if we can help in any small way to make a difference, we know that can potentially help a family in their healing journey. And so I think a lot of us really have that as the forefront in our minds when we're doing these cases and this hard work, that we know it's helping someone, especially when we're creating that safe, comfortable environment so that they're not experiencing more trauma. And so knowing that we have a specific setup, and that we're so intentional about everything that we do, and that we just want to give people the best experience possible given the circumstances.
Of course.
That it does help us to know that, and we do hear from families a lot of, this was better than I thought it would be, or I feel a weight lifted off my shoulders, or, this was a safe place in a traumatic time. So we do get a lot of feedback from families that I think also help us to know, okay, this is the right way to do it or go about it. And, we are making a difference. And so being able to get that direct feedback from families kind of offers ourselves our own reassurance in the process. So so I think all of those things combined. And then the other thing I would add, and I always kind of feel cheesy when I say it, but having that community support. So when we have community that either that's through fundraising or different events, or just knowing who we are and the work that we do, and, providing snacks or, donations of that type, knowing that our community sees these families as well and sees us as well, truly makes a difference. I mean, April was Child Abuse Prevention Month. We sell pinwheels as a sign of child abuse prevention. and
We see them all over
yeah,
community.
and exactly, like when we're driving by and we see those, like it's so uplifting and it gives hope of, okay, other people care
Mm-hmm.
and other people, these families matter to other people. So that in and of itself too also helps us with the motivation to continue moving forward in hard cases.
Can you, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Jill. I really am. Can you talk about the pinwheels? Because, as an advocate that's been around doing this, and I say this a lot, since the 1900s, I've seen those pinwheels for many, 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 many years. And I'd like you to talk about that too, because I think that's a really important thing to bring awareness as to not only for child victims, but for the work that your folks are doing.
Yeah, so I don't know the full history of kind of how the pinwheels came to be, but they did come to be a national symbol of child abuse. And I think part of it is, sort of that a pinwheel is moving.
Mm-hmm.
And so, things are evolving and changing and growing. So it's also kind of, like a plant coming out of the ground, except it's, a pinwheel, but just a symbol of hope as well. They're typically blue and silver in color, and so blue being kind of a representative of hope. So having these sort of moving but pretty things saying, this is an issue and this is something that's happening, but also there's something, there's progress that can be made with that. And we've done a couple large gardens in the past, like with one pinwheel for every child we've served, which is typically over 1,000 per year. And so having those large gardens also kind of representing like, this is what's happening in our own community. And so don't forget that this is happening, because it, can be it is hard, and it can be a hard thing for people to think about, much less actually talk about. So to have sort of a prettier symbol of something that's going on, if you will, just lends itself then to at least the recognition of, okay, this is happening, and how could we help in any small way?
And so, and just, a quick question on that, kind of going back to the forensic interviews. And I meant to ask this earlier. How long would a typical interview last? Because, some children, obviously, that they might have, attention issues, that kind of a thing. How long can something like that last?
Good question again. So yeah, again, really varies per child. So we allow anywhere from, or we expect, I should say, anywhere from 20 minutes for our little ones up to 3 hours for our older kids. So it can really it just depends on the person. So yeah, when we're dealing with our little ones, especially if they're not even of school age yet, sitting and attention can be hard. And that's where we might, they might be in there for 5 minutes and then they take a break and play a little bit more and come back and, talk for another 5 minutes. And so the whole process in itself can take 30 minutes, even if they were only talking for 20 of that. But, that's pretty typical for our younger kids. But we can get some 7, 8, 9-year-olds who spend a whole hour in there and they just have lots to chat about. And then we can have some older kids, too, who maybe they don't have a lot to say, or they're not quite ready to share all. And so maybe they only spend 30 minutes to an hour. And then we have some who they're very much ready and they have a lot to share, and so they could spend anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. So kind of takes as long as it takes is what we tell our caregivers of what to expect. We want to allow children to share their story and do that in their own way, and so whatever that looks like, we try to be flexible and go with it,
of course.
But yeah, so I would say in general, probably anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours is a fairly standard, depending on the age, but it could be a little less or it could be a little more.
Okay. And I would probably say too, because, working in this field as long as I have, and having the historical institutional knowledge of it as you do, certainly back in the day, not having this service, probably made it even more difficult for those children, who are talking about these things to, police officers, detectives, social workers, whomever. And then of course progressing to the level where you're at, which is much more assisting to kids and much more of assistance to the criminal justice system in itself. How do you see the process, the work that you do in the long term, the continuing process of it? Do you see any changes coming along? Do you see things forecasted that might make program changes? Because I'm sure when you first started your agency, there was the question of, well, maybe we should add this to the room to make it a little bit more. I mean, and that's all just about progress that you're doing. Do you have any, what do you see as that coming up, long term?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind when you ask that. So one is, like you said, some changes we've already made, for example, is we have different fidgets. We do have a rocking chair. We see a greater need in our neurodiverse population right now. And so kind of looking at some tips and tricks and some tweaks with our services there. Actually, when we were chatting earlier about kind of doing a tour and stuff, we also do have videos on our website just so
wonderful.
families can see ahead of time. And that's not just for our neurodiverse population, but really for anybody who's not been in that situation before, to be able to, have a little bit more knowledge of what to expect and kind of what they're walking into before they literally walk through our doors.
That's wonderful, because a lot of people would have no idea what to expect. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and those just came out. I mean, we just did those within the last year. So that's, a step that we
Definitely
made in that way. But I also think, so I think backing up too in terms of advocacy centers also started really focusing mostly on child sex abuse, because they really saw, without that physical piece in a physical abuse situation where we have marks and bruises, there's nothing necessarily to see and identify. So that's why we need to talk to these kids. Over time, a lot of advocacy centers now see any type of crime involving a kid. So that could be witness to homicide or domestic violence or human trafficking or neglect, just general neglect and all sorts of things. So I do see, that we continue moving forward in involving or child advocacy centers being involved in any type of case that's involving a child victim or a child witness. But honestly, I could see expanding services with adults. When I first started at Ralston House, we didn't really see adults. And here and there, we would see an adult with developmental disability. But it was pretty rare. Now we see about maybe 50 or so a year, which still isn't huge for our overall numbers, but it's certainly more than, a couple. And really seeing how they, in their state of trauma and how they're responding or reacting to a situation, how a forensic interview process and in a neutral setting can also really be beneficial to them. So I do see kind of moving that way, that it's not just going to be a child advocacy center, but it's going to be an advocacy center that offers forensic interviews for anyone who needs it, to have that specialized training and specialized process before they go through the rest of the criminal justice system.
I think that's wonderful too, because, even in the work that we do as advocates in this community, we're always looking to be progressive about, what we do, but we're also looking for every opportunity to provide that, because, the criminal justice system is reactive. We don't do a lot of prevention, and that's just kind of how the system is, because, when I first started doing this work, there was almost no talk of ID theft. There was almost no talk of human trafficking, but obviously they occurred. And so the work that you're doing is giving that space for children to talk about these things. It's giving that collaboration, having that collaboration with law enforcement, because as advocates, we know sometimes that can be a little difficult just because of the work that we do. But I think that's wonderful how you're able to create that space, create that collaboration, create that unity, for children. So I'll give you a little bit of a scenario here as we, come, talking about the work that you do. Let's say, for instance, you and I, or, you're at the Adams County Courthouse. And as you know, that courthouse, it's not the original courthouse, because I remember being in that one, where it was made back in the 50s, and lime green walls, and we had no air conditioning. Now the courthouse, it's very pretty, So let's say, for instance, you're in the elevator and somebody's asking you, hey, what do you do? And you say you work for Ralston House. And that person asks you, well, what's Ralston House? Kind of give me your elevator speech to that so people know the work that you guys do.
Yeah, so I would say Ralston House is a child advocacy center. We provide forensic interviewing and victim advocacy to children and families who have been victims or witnesses to a variety of crimes. And our goal is to help them navigate the criminal justice process and provide whatever support and resources are necessary or helpful for them in their healing journey as they move through that.
That actually is a really good elevator speech. That was actually really good, Jill. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. And, in doing the work that you do, I always tell people, that not only to appreciate that you've been here today with us, Jill, but also to let people know, if they would like information about Ralston House and the wonderful services they provide for child abuse victims, please go to their website at www.ralstonhouse.org. They provide those services for children, as you've heard Jill talk about, not only for children, who've been, directly assaulted, harmed, hurt, but also, any types of crimes that are involving children. If you have a question for them, please contact them. And Jill, I want to thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you again for having us. It's been a pleasure.
The Colorado Victim Advocate podcast. We can be found on Spotify or on our YouTube channel. And we certainly hope that you join us for another episode. As you've heard today, Jill and her colleagues at Ralston House as victims advocates, they are certainly a noun, a subject, a verb, and an adjective. And I want to thank everybody for listening to us today. Thank you.